It was the kind of night that made you feel like the world had slowed down. The kind where every mile stretched endlessly and the hum of the truck engine became a distant lullaby. James, a seasoned trucker, was well acquainted with these long nights on the road. He'd driven the same stretch of Highway 68 hundreds of times, but tonight was different. It was 2:47 a.m., and the world outside was a black void. The road, lit only by the dim glow of his headlights, felt deserted. Not a single car in sight, not even the usual glow of distant town lights in the horizon. Just darkness. The familiar solitude of the night should have been comforting, but it felt wrong. James squinted into the night, trying to make out anything that could break up the monotony of the road. That's when he saw it. A shadow in the distance, larger than anything he'd seen on this stretch. At first, it appeared to be just another truck, an overworked rig making its slow crawl down the highway. But as James got closer, he realized something was horribly off. This truck, massive, dark, and almost blending into the night, had no headlights. There was no gleam of the usual truck lights that flicker from the sides. No red reflectors warning of its presence. It was just a large, looming shadow, floating across the road, barely making a sound. James leaned forward, frowning, his fingers tightening around the wheel. Was it a malfunction? Maybe the driver had fallen asleep, but as he drove closer, a chill settled over him. The truck's movement was strange, too smooth, almost too perfect. No jolts, no vibrations from the tires against the asphalt. It was gliding, as if it wasn't really touching the ground at all. He grabbed the radio, his fingers shaking just slightly. A crackle of static filled the cab, then silence. He adjusted the dial, trying to reach anyone, but there was nothing. Not a single voice from the truckers, who usually filled the airwaves. His stomach churned. James tried again, more forcefully, but the same void met him on the other end. Panic started creeping in, but he pushed it down. He told himself it was just a breakdown. But when he looked to the left, where he expected to see the driver's face, there was nothing. The seat was empty. The truck was moving on its own. His breath caught in his throat. The road ahead was clear, just him and his phantom vehicle. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he tried to steady his racing heartbeat. With one last glance at the eerie, silent rig, he slammed his foot down on the accelerator. He needed to get away from it. But as he sped up, trying to put distance between him and the ghostly truck, something worse happened. It started to follow. Slowly at first, almost as if it wasn't trying to catch up. But the more James pushed his rig, the closer the phantom truck seemed to get. There was no engine sound, no tire screeching on the pavement, just a creeping feeling of being followed. He glanced in his rearview mirror, expecting to see a flash of headlights, but the mirror revealed only the empty stretch of road behind him. But then, just as his heart started to calm, the truck reappeared. It was right there, still behind him, as if it had been following for miles. James slammed his foot harder on the gas, trying to break free. But the faster he went, the slower it seemed to move, its empty presence trailing behind like an inescapable shadow. As he passed through another curve, something flickered, a brief moment of movement, and then the truck was gone. No trace, no skid marks, not even a lingering shadow. It was as if the truck had never existed, swallowed up by the dark road. James drove on, breathing heavily, his hand still clutching the steering wheel as if it could anchor him to reality. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Something not meant to be on that road. The road remained silent. The radio was still dead. And in the distance, the faintest whisper of an eerie hum seemed to follow him. But when he turned the corner, there was nothing left. Only the darkness. Have you ever experienced something that seemed impossible on the road? A shadow that shouldn't have been there? A presence that wouldn't leave? Let us know in the comments. James tried to shake off what he had just experienced. He needed to finish his shift, get to his destination, and put that haunting encounter behind him. But every mile after that strange truck felt heavier, as though the road itself was watching him. Every flicker of the headlights, every creak of the truck's chassis set his nerves on edge. The silence in the cab was deafening. He reached for the radio again, trying to call out to anyone, but it remained lifeless, static filling the empty space. For a moment, he considered pulling over, taking a break to calm his racing heart, but something held him back. He had been on this road for too long to let fear take hold now. Besides, he wasn't the only one on these highways. Truckers often shared stories, swapping tales of strange happenings and close calls. James needed to find a fellow driver, someone to confirm that what he had seen wasn't just a product of fatigue. Minutes stretched into hours, and the shadows of the highway grew deeper. Then, through the rear-view mirror, he saw it again. The truck, the same shadow, the same eerie stillness. It was far behind him at first, just a faint outline of headlights in the distance. But the further he drove, the closer it got. There was no sound of tires, no engine rumble, just the sound of his own breath, heavy in the cab. James' hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white. His eyes flicked to the side mirror, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw the outline of a figure in the driver's seat, just a shadow against the dark glass. But when he blinked, the figure was gone. The truck was still there, following. This time, James wasn't going to let it slip away. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, eager to distance himself from the truck. But with each passing second, the rig kept gaining ground. It wasn't just following anymore. It was matching his speed, keeping perfectly in sync with his every move. The highway twisted ahead, a sharp curve that should have forced the truck to slow down. But it didn't. The shadow of the truck seemed to glide around the corner, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules of physics that governed James' rig. Panic bubbled up inside him, but he kept driving, unwilling to stop. He had to know what was going on. Then, in an instant, the shadow disappeared. James slammed on the brakes, his heart thumping in his chest. His headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the road ahead. Nothing, no truck, no faint outline in the distance. It was as if the rig had vanished into thin air, leaving only the empty highway behind. He sat there, breathless, eyes scanning the darkness. Had it been real? Had he imagined it? But as his pulse slowed, he could feel the weight of something unexplainable pressing down on him. The truck had followed him. He had felt it. It had been there, right behind him, but now it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. The eerie silence that surrounded James seemed even more oppressive now. The road stretched endlessly before him, swallowed by the inky blackness of the night. His truck's engine hummed softly, the only sound to break the stillness, but it felt as if the very air around him was waiting, holding its breath. Every mile he drove, he couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that something was watching him, following him, even though his rearview mirror remained empty. But then, it happened again. He passed the old, run-down gas station, a decaying relic on the side of the road that had seen better days. And in that moment, a chill crawled down his spine. As his headlights illuminated the dark stretch of highway ahead, he caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. A faint glow, a truck, the unmistakable outline of its massive frame cutting through the dark, slowly gaining on him. It wasn't the headlights of another trucker. This was different. The glow wasn't right, soft, almost ethereal, as if it wasn't really there at all. But James couldn't deny it. His heart raced as he glanced in the mirror again, confirming what he had feared. The truck was back. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white, but he tried to keep his breathing steady. He had to stay calm. He'd been through a lot tonight, but he couldn't let fear take control now. He sped up, trying to outrun the strange truck once again. But the faster he went, the closer the glow seemed to get. It was as if the truck was no longer behind him. It was alongside him now. James couldn't understand how it was possible. His truck was moving faster, but this phantom truck seemed to move with him, staying perfectly parallel. He looked to his left, and in the corner of his eye, he caught the faintest movement, a shadowy figure just behind the wheel. The figure was impossibly still, and the truck, though large and imposing, made no noise. There was no rumble of the engine, no sound of tires against the road. It was as though the truck was floating, silently gliding beside him. He couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. His grip tightened on the wheel, his hands slick with sweat. But then something even more terrifying happened. The radio, which had been quiet for hours, suddenly crackled to life, breaking the silence with an eerie hiss. "Leave now!" The voice was faint at first, barely a whisper. But then it grew louder, more urgent. "It's not too late. Get off the road. They're coming for you." The voice was low and distorted, as if it were coming from a deep well or a long-forgotten grave. It was cold, bone-chillingly cold. The words echoed through the cab, reverberating in James' skull. He froze, unable to look away from the phantom truck beside him. The voice on the radio didn't stop. It continued, a warning he couldn't ignore. "They've been waiting for you." James' heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced. Who was that? Where was it coming from? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that the voice was somehow connected to the truck? The voice was warning him to leave. But leave where? He tried to turn the volume down, but the radio dial seemed unresponsive. The crackling voice filled the cab, louder now, filling his ears, pressing against his temples. Every word carried with it a sense of urgency, a desperate plea. But the strangest part was that the voice was eerily familiar, as though he had heard it before, buried deep within his memory. "Get off the road," the voice repeated, "before it's too late." His fingers trembled as he twisted the dial, desperate to stop the noise, but it was as if the voice was inside his head now, whispering through the very air around him. And then he saw it, the figure in the truck. James' breath caught in his throat. The truck's window was rolled down, and through the darkness, he could see the reflection in the glass. At first, there was nothing, just blackness, like a mirror into an empty void. But as his eyes adjusted, something flickered. There, just behind the wheel, was a shadow, a figure. The reflection was too blurry to make out any details, but the longer he stared, the more unsettling it became. The figure's presence was wrong. It felt as though it shouldn't be there, as though it was out of place, out of time. And then, as if answering his unspoken question, the figure shifted slightly. The reflection changed. It was him. James' own face stared back at him, wide-eyed, horrified, his expression one of sheer terror. He jerked his head away, his breath catching in his throat, but when he looked back, the figure was gone. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The world outside the truck seemed to freeze. His foot hovered over the accelerator. The phantom truck was still there, gliding silently alongside him, matching his speed. The voice on the radio, still clear as day, continued to haunt him. It's not just a truck. James' hands shook uncontrollably. His foot slammed down on the gas pedal, desperate to escape whatever this was. But no matter how fast he went, the truck was always there, a silent specter in the dark, never gaining, never falling behind. It followed him, always just a step behind, but never disappearing. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the truck vanished. One moment, it was there right alongside him. The next, it was gone, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. The radio fell silent. The highway, once filled with tension and terror, now seemed eerily quiet. James, heart pounding, drove on, but the nagging feeling of being followed lingered. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing. The road stretched ahead, empty, dark, just the sound of his tires against the pavement. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but one thing was certain. He was never alone on that road again. James couldn't understand what was happening. The eerie silence that enveloped him on the road now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. The truck, that truck, was gone, but the sense of dread, the feeling that something was wrong, never left. He couldn't shake the idea that he wasn't alone out there on the highway. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every curve in the road seemed to hold a secret. The darkness outside felt like it was closing in, suffocating him. He drove for what felt like hours, his headlights cutting through the dark, but revealing little more than the endless asphalt ahead. His eyes darted nervously from the rearview mirror to the side windows, scanning the night, half expecting the ghostly truck to appear once more. But nothing came. Still, the unease gnawed at him. He could feel the weight of the road, the pressure of every mile. But there was no escape from the nagging sensation that something was following, waiting. Then, suddenly, it happened again. A flicker in the distance. At first, it was just a faint light, a set of headlights barely visible against the backdrop of the black sky. James squinted, wondering if he was imagining it. But no, there was again, the same glow, distant yet unerringly close. He couldn't take his eyes off it, his heart beginning to race once more. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but the moment those headlights appeared, the air around him changed. The temperature seemed to drop. The oppressive silence deepened. James' skin tingled with the sensation of being watched. His breath caught in his throat, and a wave of panic rose within him. The glow grew brighter, slowly, steadily. It wasn't just one truck this time. It was several, at least 3, maybe more, lined up in a perfect row, coming toward him. Their headlights gleamed cold and white, cutting through the night with an unnatural precision. James' grip on the wheel tightened as his eyes darted from one rig to another, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. He glanced behind him, but there was no sign of the convoy. It seemed to appear out of nowhere. But when he looked forward again, they were there, right there, as though they had materialized from thin air. The convoy moved as one, perfectly synchronized. The trucks glided silently down the highway, their massive forms looming in the dark like specters of the night. James couldn't explain it. No sound, no engine roar, nothing, just the lights. The hollow presence of these trucks that shouldn't be there, moving toward him with chilling purpose. His hands were clammy on the wheel. His mind screamed at him to pull over, to get off the road, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in place, trapped in the headlights of the convoy, unable to turn away. The trucks weren't just passing by. They were coming for him, slowly, methodically, like they were surrounding him, closing him in. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, desperate to break free. But the moment he tried to accelerate, the convoy accelerated with him. The trucks mirrored his every move, staying right alongside him. He tried to speed up, but they kept pace. Slowed down, they slowed with him. No matter what he did, the convoy remained right there, surrounding him, suffocating him. James' eyes flicked to the side mirror. He could see the rigs now, tall looming giants, their steel frames casting long shadows in the dark. But the longer he looked, the more distorted they became. The edges of the trucks flickered in and out of focus, as if they were not entirely real. They didn't belong in this world. A voice crackled through the radio again, faint at first, but then growing louder, louder than before. It was the same voice he had heard earlier, the one that had warned him to leave. But this time, the voice wasn't just a warning. It was angry. You can't escape them. Not now. Not ever. The words sent a shiver down James' spine, and his breath quickened. The voice had changed. Now it was full of malice, of something darker. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It felt like a curse. The trucks were getting closer. James' hands trembled on the wheel, his pulse pounding in his throat. He could feel his heart racing, beating faster, faster than ever before. Sweat poured down his face as the lights from the convoy grew blindingly bright, their glow now filling the entire cab of the truck, drowning him in their eerie, otherworldly light. His headlights flickered, then died. The road ahead plunged into darkness. The convoy didn't stop. He slammed the switch, trying to turn the headlights back on, but nothing happened. The lights were gone. The silence was deafening. The only sound the relentless hum of his engine, now drowned out by the deep growl of engines from the trucks surrounding him. But still no sound. It was as if they were ghosts, trucks without life, without sound, without reason. And they were closing in on him, their headlights burning into his eyes, blinding him. James' breath caught in his throat. His heart raced. This was it. He couldn't escape. He wasn't meant to escape. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the convoy was gone. The headlights vanished, leaving James alone on the highway, surrounded by an empty, oppressive darkness. The radio fell silent. The road was still. The trucks were gone. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, lingered deep in the pit of his stomach. Something inside him knew he wasn't alone. He never would be again. James sat frozen in his truck, his hands still gripped tightly to the steering wheel. The eerie silence that followed the disappearance of the convoy was almost worse than the events leading up to it. The headlights had vanished. The convoy was gone, but the feeling, the sensation that something was still there lingered. It crawled under his skin, gnawed at his senses. He wasn't alone. The road stretched out in front of him, but it felt wrong. It felt unfamiliar. He had driven this route countless times before, but tonight it was as though the highway had changed. It wasn't the same road. The familiar landmarks, the faded signs, the twisted trees, the rusted fences were gone. He glanced to his left, his eyes searching for something familiar, anything that could anchor him to reality. But there was nothing, just endless darkness. The road was endless, winding, stretching into the abyss with no end in sight. The chill in the air had deepened, and the weight of the night pressed in on him like a suffocating force. He reached for the radio again, desperate for some sense of normalcy, something to break the oppressive silence. His fingers trembled as he turned the dial. Static. Nothing more. He tried again, but the radio only hissed in response, offering no solace, no answers. Then, just as he was about to give up, a voice broke through the static. Low, faint, but unmistakable. You shouldn't be here. James froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He spun around in his seat, half expecting to see someone or something sitting next to him. But there was no one. The cab was empty. His eyes darted back to the road ahead. The voice wasn't coming from the truck. It was coming from the very air around him. It was inside his mind, whispering to him, urging him to turn back. Turn around. It's too late. You're not on the right road. He swallowed hard, the words sinking into him like ice. He wasn't on the right road? What did that even mean? He had driven this highway countless times, yet tonight, it felt like he was trapped in some twisted version of reality, a version that wasn't meant to be. He glanced to the side, his gaze flicking over the dark landscape. That's when he saw it. In the distance, barely visible in the low light, a sign. It was faded, almost impossible to read, but the words were unmistakable. Welcome to the Forgotten Highway. The Forgotten Highway. His heart skipped a beat. He'd never seen that sign before. It didn't belong. No one ever talked about a forgotten highway. No trucker he knew had ever mentioned it. His pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of it. What was this place? Why was he here? And then the road seemed to shift. The asphalt beneath him began to warp, twisting in ways that defied logic. The lines on the road flickered and disappeared, leaving only a dark, endless void stretching ahead. His headlights dimmed once more, as if the light itself was being swallowed by the darkness. He floored the gas pedal, desperate to get out of whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. But no matter how fast he drove, the road remained the same, endless, stretching into the abyss. The sign, the road, the feeling of being watched, it was all wrong. It was as if the world around him had bent, twisted, and forced him into some alternate reality, a place where time didn't exist, and the laws of nature had no power. The radio crackled again, the same voice, this time louder and more insistent. You shouldn't have followed them. Now you're lost. James felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He wasn't sure who or what was speaking to him, but he could feel it now. He was caught. He was trapped in this place, in this twisted version of reality, and there was no way out. The trucks, the convoy, the strange warnings, they were all part of it. He had been lured into something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The road he was on wasn't just a highway. It was a trap, a place for lost souls, a place where truckers vanished, never to be seen again. The voice on the radio grew louder, almost mocking. Welcome to the Forgotten Highway. You'll never leave. James slammed his foot down on the brake, but the truck didn't slow. It wasn't stopping. The road twisted in front of him, bending and warping as if it had a life of its own. His truck sped forward, faster and faster, but there was no escape, no way to turn back, no way to leave. And then, as if everything had been building to this one final moment, the radio went silent. Everything went silent. For the first time since he had entered the Forgotten Highway, James felt the weight of the darkness closing in on him, suffocating him. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't escape. The headlights flickered one last time, and then all went black. Have you ever felt completely lost, like you were on a road that shouldn't exist? Or maybe you've encountered something that made you question everything you knew about reality. Share your experiences in the comments below. James awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. His body was drenched in sweat, and his breath came in shallow gasps. The air around him was cold, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones and made you question whether you were even alive. His eyes snapped open, but the darkness was overwhelming. He couldn't see a thing. No headlights, no faint outline of the road, no familiar truck cab. Just blackness, complete, suffocating blackness. The silence was deafening, and the emptiness around him felt endless. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for the dashboard light, his hands shaking. The world around him was still as death, and the low hum of the engine was the only thing grounding him to reality, if there was even such a thing anymore. He finally found the switch, and with a flick of his fingers, the interior lights flickered on, casting a weak glow around the cab. The truck was still there, his truck, but everything outside, the road, the sky, was gone. The darkness stretched out in every direction like an infinite void, swallowing up everything in its path. He stared out the windshield, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Nothing. No stars. No road signs. No other vehicles. Just black. Just endless nothingness. The radio came to life once more. That voice, the same voice that had tormented him throughout the night. It crackled through the static, low and menacing, like it was waiting for him to hear it. You're trapped now. You've crossed the line. The voice was calmer now, almost like a whisper, but it carried an undeniable sense of finality. James' chest tightened. His eyes darted to the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the convoy again. But there was nothing. No trucks. No headlights. No sign of life. He reached for the radio, his fingers trembling. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper into the cold, silent air. "Where am I? What's happening?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static grew louder, more intense, as if it were drowning out his very thoughts. And then it hit him. The realization crashed into him like a tidal wave, overwhelming him, filling every inch of his mind. He wasn't just lost. He wasn't on the road anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere beyond the world he knew. The Forgotten Highway wasn't a place on a map. It wasn't just an abandoned road or an isolated stretch of asphalt. It was a dimension, a realm beyond time and space, a place where things that shouldn't exist came to life. And James had driven straight into it. He tried to turn the truck around, but the wheel refused to budge. The engine roared in protest, but the truck was frozen. No matter how much he yanked, how hard he pushed, the road didn't bend. There was no exit, no way to turn back. His mind raced. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion and fear. How could he get out? Was there a way out? Could he ever go home? The voice returned, as cold and detached as ever. You can never leave. The word sent a jolt of fear through him, sharper than anything he had felt before. He wanted to scream, to rage against the impossible, but the words caught in his throat. The fear wasn't just terror anymore. It was an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. He was trapped, forever. The road, the trucks, the endless night. It was all part of the curse. The forgotten highway claimed the lost. Those who had driven too far, who had ventured too deep, who had dared to cross its invisible threshold. And now James was one of them. In the distance, he saw something flicker, just a tiny pinprick of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough to draw his attention. Desperate, he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, hoping against hope that it would lead him out of the darkness. But the light didn't grow closer. It remained the same, a distant, unreachable star. Suddenly, everything shifted. The truck jolted forward, as if pulled by some unseen force. The radio crackled, louder now, almost deafening, but the voice was gone. Instead, there was only the sound of distorted static, growing louder and louder until it felt like his ears would explode. The light ahead flickered, and then everything went black. When James awoke again, it was different. The darkness wasn't the same. It felt deeper, more suffocating. He was no longer in the truck. He wasn't even sure where he was. The air around him was thick, almost suffocating, with a strange heaviness that weighed down on his chest. His body felt cold, and the faint hum of the truck's engine was gone. There was no rumbling, no sounds of the world outside, just silence. He blinked, his vision blurry, as his senses slowly returned to him. The first thing he noticed was the ground beneath him, smooth, hard, and metallic. He was lying on something, but it wasn't the soft, worn fabric of his truck seat. The texture was cold, slick, like steel. He tried to sit up, but his body felt sluggish, as if it wasn't responding properly. He looked around, squinting through the thick blackness. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no road, no truck, no lights, no sign of life, not even the faint glow of distant headlights. He was in a void, a place with no boundaries, no horizon, just the crushing weight of endless blackness surrounding him, a place that defied all logic, a place he couldn't escape from. But there was something else in the distance, a flicker, a movement. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer the longer he stared. In the farthest reaches of this void, he saw a figure, a shadow, moving through the darkness. Slowly, purposefully, his heart skipped a beat as he tried to rise to his feet, but his legs felt weak, unsteady. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled toward the figure, desperate for some sign of life, some connection to reality. The figure moved toward him, its form obscured by the darkness, but it was coming closer. Closer. "Who are you?" James whispered, his voice trembling in the emptiness. The figure didn't answer, but it was there, undeniably real, and growing nearer with every passing moment. He could see it more clearly now, and what he saw made his heart stop. The figure was him, It was a twisted, distorted version of himself. Hollow eyes, a twisted grin that stretched unnaturally wide. The figure's face was ashen, pale, lifeless. James froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as the figure reached out toward him, he felt a cold hand grip his arm, its fingers icy and firm. The touch sent a jolt of terror through his entire body. The figure's grin widened even more, and his voice, spoke, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was dark, twisted. "You never should have come here," the figure said, its voice echoing hollow. "The road never ends for those who are lost. And you're lost, James." The figure's grip tightened, pulling him closer. He struggled, but his body felt like lead. He tried to break free, but the more he fought, the tighter the grip became. "No, no." James gasped, panic flooding his chest. "I'm not lost. I'm not." But the figure's laugh cut him off, the sound like nails scraping across a chalkboard, sharp and grating. "Oh, but you are," it whispered, its voice now a chilling rasp. "The road leads nowhere for those who dare to cross the line. You've entered the forgotten highway, and now you'll never leave." James's mind screamed for him to wake up, to escape, but it was too late. The grip on his arm was unyielding, and the darkness around him seemed to pull tighter. The world began to warp, twisting like it was being sucked into a vortex. The figure, his twisted reflection, grinned one last time before everything around James went completely black. When James opened his eyes again, he was no longer surrounded by the crushing void. His vision blurred as the world around him began to materialize. The dark, suffocating blackness lifted, and he found himself back in the truck. His hand still gripped the steering wheel, his heart hammering in his chest as if he'd just woken from a nightmare. The truck's engine hummed steadily beneath him, but there was a strange sense of déjà vu in the air. The road was there, Highway 68, just like before, the familiar stretch of asphalt winding ahead under the weak glow of the truck's headlights. But something was wrong. The road was too quiet, the air too still. He stared out the window, trying to make sense of it all. In the distance, he saw the sign, "Welcome to the Forgotten Highway." His stomach turned. He had passed the sign before everything had gone black. He had seen it on the edge of his consciousness, but now it was right there, plain as day, marking the very road that had led him into the nightmare. It wasn't just a stretch of highway. It was a trap, a place where time was distorted and reality bled into something otherworldly. The trucks, the voice, the twisted version of himself. All of it had been real. But the real horror was something even darker. This road, this highway, didn't lead anywhere. It was a loop, a prison, where lost souls wandered, never to find their way out. James had crossed the threshold, unknowingly driving into a place where the dead, the lost, and the damned were trapped for eternity. His eyes darted to the rear-view mirror. There, in the reflection, he saw the faint outline of the convoy again. The same ghostly trucks, their headlights glowing faintly in the distance. They were coming closer, moving in sync, just like before. He wasn't sure if they were real or if they were part of the endless cycle that the forgotten highway had trapped him in. But one thing was clear. He could never leave. Not now. Not ever. The voice from the radio crackled again, now cold and mocking. You're here to stay, James. Welcome to the highway that never ends. James's breath caught in his throat as the trucks grew closer. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the road stretched endlessly before him, as if mocking his every attempt to escape. No matter how fast he drove, no matter how hard he tried to outrun them, the convoy remained behind him, the trucks coming ever closer. They were trapped here just like him. They would never leave. And as the trucks drew near, the voice echoed in his mind once more. You can't escape what's already inside you. The road kept stretching, the convoy followed, and the darkness loomed ahead, swallowing everything in its path. James had become a part of the highway, a soul lost to time, wandering forever in an endless loop of terror. What do you think happens to those who wander too far from reality? Is it possible for us to get lost in places where time and space no longer exist, or are we always on the road to somewhere? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comments below.